Welcome, everybody, to another Bible study. I am Dark Desert Highway, and on this channel, we read the Bible. And today, we're going to take a look into Israel's captivity, because the Lord had given Israel the statutes and ordinances, basically the plan of living. So don't do this, do this. And today I have set before you life and death, good and evil. Choose life so that you may live and prosper by listening to what I, the Lord, have commanded you to do, to live right before my eyes. But the thing is that Israel was transitioning through kings. Like a king would come to reign, and he would reign for a certain amount of time, and then he would die, and then another king would come. And the kings weren't always following after the Lord's heart. There were many kings who did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And they sinned, which caused Israel to sin, because they had put up idols in the high places and sacrificed their children and incense and meat offerings and drink offerings, and they were basically worshiping false gods. Some of these kings would come in and they would do what is right before the eyes of the Lord, and they would cut down these high places and smash the idols and get rid of the things in the land of Israel and Judah from before the Lord's eyes. And there is in the books of the Kings, if you read it from chapter 1, 1 Kings, all the way to the last chapter of 2 Kings, you'll see that there's multiple kings who come into power, and they have different approaches to what they're going to do about being the Lord's people. They either do what is evil before the eyes of the Lord, or they do what is right before the eyes of the Lord. But this is the point. Everything we do is before the eyes of the Lord. The Lord is poised on the edge of humanity with his angels and his judgments and statutes and everything that he has given us in his word. He and the heavenly kingdom are poised on the edge of the earth. You remember Stephen, when he was stoned, he looked up and heavens opened, and he saw the Son standing at the right hand of the Father. So he's very close, and everything is done before his eyes. So we're going to look, and we're going to start in chapter 17, verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Hala, along the Habor-Gozan's river in the city of Medes. So Israel has been captured. Why have they been captured? Let's see. In verse 7, this disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they worshipped other gods. They lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of the Israel did. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. They built high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did evil things angering the Lord. They served idols, although the Lord had told them, "You must not do this." Still, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways, and keep my commands and statutes, according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants the prophets." But they would not listen. Instead, they became obstinate, like their ancestors who did not believe the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. Following the surrounding nations, the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. They abandoned all the commands of their Lord. They made cast images for themselves, 2 calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed in worship to all the stars in the sky and served Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire and practiced divination and interpreted omens, witchcraft. They devoted themselves to do what was evil in the Lord's sight and angered him. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained. Even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God, but lived according to the customs Israel had practiced. So the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, punished them, and handed them over to plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. So it was very obviously, Israel's captivity was very obviously connected to their daily life. Because they had not listened to the commandment of the Lord, instead they built themselves idols to false gods who were no gods at all. And they worshiped them, and they burnt incense to them. They even caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire in demon worship. That's really what it is. It's worshiping demons, worshiping idols, worshiping gods that are no gods. Let's continue. 21. When the Lord tore Israel from the house of David, Israel made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Then Jeroboam led Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit grave sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Finally, the Lord removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared through all his servants the prophets. So Israel had been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day. So wait a minute, you're telling me that it's not just a prayer, right? It's not just, "Lord, I believe in you. Lord, I believe that you're there. Lord, I believe in you. You are who you say you are. I believe that. I believe that you are God." But instead of making my daily life about your ordinances and statutes, I would rather build images to worship that have nothing to do with you. Even though I know you're there, even though I know that I am of the race of chosen people that you have set aside for yourself, I will make it my daily chase to serve other things that are not God as gods in place of you. I'm going to serve alcohol. I'm going to serve drugs. I'm going to serve women. I'm going to serve myself. I'm going to serve my body. I'm going to gather tokens of items that represent what I would rather serve instead of you, and I'm going to erect statues according to the images of all the evil things that are in my heart, and I'm going to worship them and sacrifice to them and cause all the gifts that you have given me to go to worship of these images, of these false gods. So the Lord wouldn't have it anymore. He was faithful in his promise to prosper the people in obedience, and now he is showing himself faithful to fulfill his words against Israel in their disobedience. And they have been taken captive, and they have been led away to Assyria to serve a nation whose language they do not know, who worship strange gods that they do not know, and they will become servants to them in consequence of not obeying the Lord. So the Lord's faithful to put away from his sight all the things that are evil in his sight, and make, even though they were his children, make them go into captivity so that they would understand that the Lord is a fulfiller of his promises in good or in evil. Let's continue in verse 24. Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the place of the Israelites in the cities of Samaria. So the king of Assyria is bringing people from Babylon to occupy the cities of Israel, because he had just taken captive all the people out of the cities of Israel, and now he's placing Babylonians to occupy Israel in the Israelites' place. Okay? So the settlers took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. When they first lived there, they did not fear the Lord. So the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. The settlers said to the king of Assyria, "The nations that you have deported and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the requirements of the God of the land. Therefore, he, the God of the land, has sent lions among them that are killing them, because their people don't know the requirements of the God of the land." So the Lord was still protective of what he had given Israel in fulfilling the promise to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of the promises that he had promised in the older years. He had promised to his people, to very specific individuals. He was the God of that land, and he was not going to abandon his land, even though he had sent his people away in captivity. When the king of Assyria brought in Babylonians to occupy the Israel's territories, God didn't like that. God sent, because they were defiling the land with their own gods and with their own statues and with their own customs, and God was the God of this land. So the Lord sent lions. They sent lions down to kill the people of the land, and in the end of 26, therefore he has sent lions among them that are killing them, because they don't know the requirements of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria issued a command: "Send back one of the priests you deported. Have him go and live there, so he can teach them the requirements of the God of the land." So he said, "Look, you have captured a priest from the territory of the land of where I've captured all these Israelites. So go ahead and release one of these priests to live in the land where these Babylonians are now occupying, which is Israel, and let the priest teach the people the ways of the Lord. And he began to teach them. So one of the priests they had deported came and lived in Bethel, and he began to teach them how they should fear the Lord. But, verse 29, but the people of each nation were still making their own gods in the cities where they lived, and putting them in shrines to the high places that the people of Samaria had made. Then the men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Amamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. So what was happening was the Babylonians that occupied Israel didn't know the customs of the God of the land, didn't know the statutes and ordinances. They didn't even really necessarily follow the Lord, even though the king of Samaria had sent back a priest to teach the people the way of the Lord. But God was obviously still like he was governing the territory of the promise to David, right? To Abraham. So God was governing the area of promise, Israel and Judah. And he was causing negative things to happen because a people now occupied this land that didn't follow God. So in 32, they feared the Lord, but they also made from their ranks priests for the high places who were working for them at the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, but they also worshiped their own gods according to the practice of the nations from which they had been deported. So they knew that God was there. They knew that there was a God over this land, and they feared him. Not necessarily a fear of a reverent fear, but they were afraid. They were afraid of what God might do because of what he had done to the people in the past, like bring lions from the hills to eat the people and devour them. So they feared God. This is a different type of fear. They feared God, but not reverently. They feared the Lord, but they also worshiped their own gods, according to the practice of the nations from which they had been deported. So Israel was taken captive, and now there's a whole land, Judah and Israel, that was unoccupied. The king of Syria sent in the Babylonians to occupy that land. They were facing consequences. The Babylonians were facing consequences from a God that decided to show himself alive, a real God. I mean, something that necessarily their gods didn't do because they were all false gods. They were worshiping images. But all of a sudden, there's a God in the land where things happen, man. Things happen. And they're like, whoa, it's because a God is here. And we don't understand his ways. So let somebody from the land who occupied it before we got here come back and teach us about this God. And they feared him because of the consequences that they were seeing happening in their lives, like being ripped apart by lions. But that didn't sway them enough to abandon the worship of their own idols, it did place a fear of the Lord in their hearts. They feared the Lord, but they also worshiped their own gods, according to the practice of the nations from which they had been deported. 34. They are still observing the former practices to this day. None of them fear the Lord or observe the statutes and ordinances. So you can see there's two different fears here. You see in 33, they feared the Lord. But in 34, none of them fear the Lord. So it's not a reverential fear to observe the statutes and ordinances, acknowledging that there is a God in the land and that he has power and control, and he has something that no other God has, because all the other gods are just wood and gold and idols. He has power. Animals obey him. The people of the land, he can make armies come against the people of the land and carry them away out of consequence for their behavior. There are real consequences to being close to this God. Unlike any other God that can be named, unlike their own gods, this God has power. But that didn't matter. They feared him, but that didn't matter. They are still observing the former practices to this day. None of them fear the Lord or observe the statutes and ordinances, the law and the commandments that the Lord had commanded the descendants of Jacob, whom he had given the name of Israel. The Lord made a covenant. The Lord made a covenant with Jacob's descendants and commanded them, do not fear other gods. Do not bow and worship to them. Do not serve them. Do not sacrifice to them. Instead, fear the Lord, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm. You are to bow down to him, and you are to sacrifice to him. You are to be careful always to observe the statutes, the ordinances, the law, and the commandments he wrote for you. Do not fear other gods. Do not forget the covenant that I have made with you. Do not fear other gods, but fear the Lord your God, and he will rescue you from all your enemies. However, these nations would not listen, but continued observing their former practices. They feared the Lord, but also served their idols. Still today, their children and their grandchildren continue doing as their ancestors did. So, where was another place that this had happened, right? At Mount Sinai, after the Hebrew nation was freed from Egypt, taken through the Red Sea, taken up to Mount Sinai, and there was a long delay for Moses to come down from the mountain. And because of this delay, they decided, look, even though God is right there, because the mountain was alive with dark clouds and eruptions of lava and thunder and lightning and great visual signs that a God was there, the God was there, that their God was there right before them, right? But what did they do? They went and they took all their earrings off and they threw it into the fire and made a calf. And that's what happened, that they feared the Lord, but they also served their idols. So even in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the Lord that he had promised to that he had made promises to earlier generations, that they would be his people and that there would always be a king on the throne, and that he would make them like numerous, like the stars in the sky, all these promises that he had fulfilled. He was in the process of fulfilling, but for the people who were there, they feared the Lord but served their idols. Just like at Mount Sinai with the calf, the Hebrew word was that there were gods. It was a plural word that meant that the people had more than one God in their presence. One was the true God on Mount Sinai, and one was the false God that they had made to worship and dance around and have a festival, basically, in the honor of that golden calf. So you knew by the plurality of the Hebrew word in the portion of that scripture that they were serving the gods. But there was only one calf. There was only one calf came out. So where was the other God? He was on Mount Sinai. He was the God of the people. He was the Lord, the great I am. So what happened? What happened here? Israel is taken away captive, right? Israel is taken away captive, and in their place, the king who now commanded the territory because of his victory against Israel, because the Lord had led Israel into captivity according to his promise, right? The king decided to let the Babylonians occupy the land, but because they did not know the God of the land, they were seeing all these consequences, these real life, scary, terrifying things were happening in that land because they had moved in basically to all the Israelites' houses that were there. They occupied their land, they occupied their territory, and now all these horrible things are happening to them, and they're like, hey, there's something happening here. There's a God at work here that we don't know and we've never heard of and we've never seen. We haven't seen anything like this, but our people are dying because of it. So send a priest from captivity back to this land so that he might teach us about the God of this land. And the priest did so. He lived among the people, and he taught them to fear the Lord. They feared the Lord. They knew he was there, but they didn't obey his ordinances, commandments, and statutes because that wasn't their God. They were afraid of him in a consequential type of way, not in a reverent way. And they ended up having fear of the Lord, but continued to serve their own idols. And Israel is taken captive, and they're prisoners of war, basically. And why did this happen? Let's go back up to 7. This disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord, their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they worshipped other gods. They lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. They built high places in all their towns, from the watchtower to the fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there in all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had driven out from before them had done. They did evil things, angering the Lord. They served idols, although the Lord had told them, "You must not do this." Still, even after all this, the Lord warned. Hold on. Still, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil way and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. Instead, they became obstinate, like their ancestors who did not believe the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors, and warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves, following the surrounding nations the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. They abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God. They cast images for themselves, 2 calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed in worship to all the stars in the sky and served Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire and practiced witchcraft, divinations, and interpreted omens. They devoted themselves to do what was evil in the Lord's sight and angered him. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained. Even Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but lived according to the customs Israel had practiced. So the Lord rejected all of the descendants of Israel, punished them, and handed them over to plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. So I can see that it is very much about the way the Israelites were leading their lives. They weren't listening to the Lord. They weren't obeying his commandments. They were going after gods of other nations. They were setting up for themselves idols and worshiping them. In the land, the Lord had won for them through many victories, and in these victories, it was that the people of Israel at that time were to break down every idol and to crush them into dust and to remove them from the land. And they did, and there was peace in the land until the people's hearts were led away. Sometimes the people's hearts were led away within themselves, and other times it was because the king of the land of Israel had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord and followed and worshipped other gods. And if the leadership is corrupt, more than likely that's going to flow down to the people, and the people are going to become corrupt because of it. So, hey, this was just an interesting story that I found while reading 2 Kings, and I had hoped to share it with you. If you made it to the end, give a good hit that like and subscribe button, share this with your friend, and I'll catch you next time.